My wife Renee put a folder on the kitchen table one Tuesday night, slid it across to me without a word, and when I opened it, it was divorce paperwork, filled out in her neat handwriting right up to the signature line, which she had left blank on purpose so I'd understand this was still technically a choice. I remember the specific sound of the kitchen clock in that silence, and the way she sat with her hands folded like she'd rehearsed this, because she had, she told me later, in the bathroom mirror for 2 nights running before she finally set the folder down. "I am not moving to Thailand, Tristan," she said, in a voice so calm it scared me more than shouting would have. "I will stay married to you in Ohio. I will not stay married to you in Bangkok." That was 14 months ago. 3 nights ago in a rented house outside Chiang Mai. I asked her, half joking, if she was ready to go home for a visit next spring, and she looked at me over her book and said, without a trace of a joke in it, "Home is right here. Tristan, don't start." If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe, because I think a lot of the retirement content out there only tells one side of a decision like this, the side of the person who wanted to go, and almost nobody tells you what it actually costs, and then gives back to the person who didn't, the one who gets handed a plane ticket to somebody else's dream and has to figure out, usually alone at first, whether there's a version of that dream that could ever belong to them too. Let me back up, because you need to understand how we got to a folder on a kitchen table. I'm 63. I spent 32 years in commercial real estate outside Columbus, and by my late 50s I was quietly obsessed with the idea of retiring abroad. I'd fallen down the same YouTube rabbit holes a lot of you have fallen down. Guys my age sitting on balconies with coffee talking about their grocery bills. And I built an entire fantasy in my head over about 2 years. A whole imagined future with a mango tree and a scooter, and a version of myself that had somehow shed 30 years of stress without ever once seriously asking Renee if she wanted the same fantasy. I'd bring it up at dinner parties with friends, half joking, watching for reactions, testing the idea out on everyone except the one person whose actual agreement mattered. That was my first mistake, and it's a common one. I've since learned. I brought it to her fully formed, like a surprise I expected her to be grateful for, instead of a decision 2 people were supposed to make together. Renee had a life I hadn't fully accounted for in my planning, which is a nicer way of saying I hadn't accounted for it at all. She'd taught 3rd grade for 28 years at the same elementary school, was 2 years from her own pension vesting fully, had our daughter Ashley 20 minutes away with 2 grandkids Renee saw every single week, a book club she'd belonged to for 11 years, a sister she talked to on the phone most days, a whole dense web of small daily obligations and pleasures that, laid end to end, added up to something a lot more solid than my mango tree fantasy ever was. When I first brought up Thailand, at dinner casually the way you'd mention a restaurant you wanted to try, she just went quiet in a way I mistook for thinking it over. It took me embarrassingly long to understand that quiet wasn't consideration. It was her deciding not to fight me yet, because she assumed, reasonably, that it was a phase, the way my brief obsession with restoring a sailboat had been a phase a decade earlier, something she could wait out without ever needing to argue against it directly. It stopped being a phase when I put down a deposit on a 2-month rental in Chiang Mai, without fully consulting her on the timing, which I'm not proud of, and which is exactly the kind of thing that leads to a folder on a kitchen table. Renee found out about the deposit from a bank statement, not from me. Sitting at her own desk, paying the electric bill and finding a $1,400 charge to a property management company in Thailand she'd never heard of. And that's the part I still feel worst about of this entire story. Not the disagreement itself, which was fair, but the way I forced her hand by making unilateral moves and calling it decisiveness. She sat me down that same evening, still holding the printed statement, and told me calmly that she'd spent her whole life being decisive about small things, the school fundraiser, the family Thanksgiving, and deferential about big ones. And she was done doing that at 61 years old, for a country she'd never asked to see. Comment down below if you've ever had to talk a reluctant partner into a big life change, or been the reluctant partner yourself, because I think this particular tug of war is far more common in this community than anybody admits out loud in the comment sections. It was actually Ashley, of all people, who suggested counseling, calling me directly one night after Renee had apparently cried on the phone to her, and saying with the particular bluntness only a grown daughter can manage with her own father, "Dad, you are about to lose Mom over a vacation idea, and I don't think you've noticed yet." I hadn't noticed, or more honestly, I'd noticed, and kept deciding it would resolve itself if I just stayed patient and let the folder full of divorce paperwork sit unsigned on the counter like an empty threat instead of the genuine one it clearly was. We found a marriage counselor in Columbus who specialized, oddly specifically, in relocation conflicts, a niche I hadn't known existed until Ashley found her through a coworker who'd been through something similar with a job transfer to Singapore. What actually saved us, and I want to be specific about this because I think the specifics matter more than the sentiment, was something a counselor we saw for 6 sessions called the test drive instead of the commitment. She told us, point blank, that couples who disagree about a move like this and just force it through the same way I'd been forcing it almost always regret it. And the ones who do better are the ones who treat the first stretch as reversible, not permanent. I remember pushing back on that in the session, telling her half committing felt like it would take all the momentum out of the decision. And she looked at me, not unkindly, and said, "Tristan, the momentum you're describing is yours. Renee doesn't need momentum. She needs a door she knows she can walk back through." That sentence sat with me longer than almost anything else from those 6 weeks of sessions. So we renegotiated everything. Instead of selling the house in Ohio, which had been my original plan, we rented it out for a year to a young family relocating for a job, which meant we had somewhere to go back to if this failed. Instead of me making the plans and Renee reacting to them, we sat down together with 2 laptops and split the research, her doing healthcare and neighborhoods, me doing visas and budgets, so that whatever we ended up doing, we'd both actually chosen it, instead of one of us just enduring it. It was slower than I wanted, some weeks almost unbearably slow, for a man who'd already mentally moved in his head 2 years earlier, decorating an imaginary balcony, while Renee was still Googling hospital ratings and school holiday flight prices back to Ohio. But it was the first time in the whole process that Renee started asking questions instead of just answering mine. Renee cried at the airport, and not the good kind of tears. Ashley hugged her mother for a long time on the curb outside departures, both of them pretending not to notice the security guard glancing over, and I stood a few feet away with our bags feeling like the villain in my own family's story. Which, in a real sense, for that particular morning, I was. My grandson, Ashley's youngest, was too small to understand any of it, and just kept asking why Grandma was sad if she got to ride on an airplane, which nobody in that whole tearful group had the heart to properly answer. The first 6 weeks in Chiang Mai were, honestly, close to the worst stretch of our marriage. Renee didn't complain constantly, which almost made it harder, because what I got instead was a kind of careful, polite distance, like living with a very gracious house guest instead of a wife of 34 years. She'd go through the motions, grocery shopping, cooking, the two of us touring temples I'd wanted to see for years, and I could see her doing all of it as a kind of performance of trying, without the actual current of wanting underneath it. There was one particular Sunday, about 5 weeks in, when I suggested we go see Wat Phra Singh, one of the most beautiful temples in the city, and she came along, took the photos, said the polite things, and then in the song to you on the way home, just started crying, quietly, facing the window so I wouldn't see, and when I asked what was wrong, she said, "Nothing. It's beautiful. I'm fine." In a tone that told me the opposite of every word. She missed her grandkids in a way that showed up physically. This specific slump to her shoulders on the days she'd have normally had them over. Days she still tracked on a calendar in her head even 8,600 miles away, marking Tuesdays and Thursdays, with a private grief she rarely mentioned out loud, but that I could read in her posture across the breakfast table every single time. She missed her classroom, of all things, which surprised me. Not the kids exactly, but the structure of it. The feeling of being needed by a room full of people every single day, which retirement in a foreign country had stripped from her overnight, with nothing yet built to replace it. The turn started with a cooking class of all things, which she signed up for almost out of boredom rather than enthusiasm. A small group taught by a Thai woman named Kanya out of her own home kitchen near the old city. 6 or 7 of us crowded around 2 gas burners on a covered patio. Renee came back from that first class more animated than I'd seen her in 2 months. Not because of the food exactly, though she did make a pad kra pao that night better than anything we'd eaten in a restaurant, but because Kanya had asked her, halfway through, almost as an aside, while they were both pounding chilies in a mortar, whether she'd ever taught anything herself. Renee mentioned the 28 years of 3rd grade, and Kanya's whole face changed. And by the end of that class, Renee had somehow agreed to help Kanya's youngest daughter with her English homework twice a week. Completely unplanned. Completely unlike the careful, polite distance she'd been living inside for 6 weeks. I remember her coming home that first tutoring evening, practically buzzing, describing in detail how the girl, Nam, had struggled with past tense verbs, and how Renee had found, almost instinctively, the exact same little trick with colored index cards she'd used on 2nd graders in Ohio 20 years earlier. That tutoring turned into more tutoring, which turned into Renee volunteering 3 mornings a week at a small after-school program near our rental, teaching basic English to kids whose parents worked the market stalls nearby, a program run out of a converted shophouse by a retired school teacher named Anong, who'd started it herself 15 years earlier, with 4 students and a single blackboard. I want to be honest that I had almost nothing to do with this turn. I didn't engineer it, didn't suggest it, mostly just watched it happen from a slight distance, the way you watch weather change, grateful and a little superfluous all at once, occasionally deployed to carry boxes of donated books or fix a broken fan, useful in the margins of something that was clearly, unmistakably, hers, Renee, a woman who'd spent 28 years managing a classroom of 8-year-olds, discovered that Thailand had an entire hidden economy of children who needed exactly what she knew how to give, and giving it back to her in a completely unplanned way gave her something the golf courses and temple tours I'd been dragging her to never could. She also found her own women's group, a mix of expat wives and a few Thai women married to Western husbands, meeting most Thursdays at a coffee shop that did decent scones. And I noticed, watching her get ready for that first meeting, that she was choosing what to wear the way you choose an outfit for something you're actually looking forward to, not the flat resignation she'd been dressing with for weeks before that. She came home from those Thursdays with stories that had nothing to do with me. A woman named Pim whose husband had died, and who'd built an entire second life running a small guest house. A Canadian woman named Fiona, who'd left her own marriage back home entirely and never looked back. An Australian named Diane, who'd moved for her husband's job 40 years ago, and never once regretted staying even after the marriage that brought her there had long since ended. Women whose lives gave Renee a wider set of possibilities than the one narrow lane, wife of a man who wanted to retire abroad, that she'd felt herself shrunk into those first 6 weeks. She started bringing Kanya to a few of those Thursdays too, which felt, watching it happen, like watching 2 separate parts of her new life quietly braid themselves together without any help from me at all. Around month 4, I noticed she'd stopped saying "you're Thailand" and started saying "here." Small shift. I don't think she noticed it herself until I pointed it out one night over dinner, and she got a little defensive about it, in the specific way people get defensive when you've caught them changing their mind before they were ready to admit it out loud, insisting for a full minute that she'd always said "here," until she stopped mid-sentence, laughed at herself, and admitted she genuinely hadn't noticed the shift at all. The 2-month rental turned into 6 months, turned into us not renewing the tenant's lease back in Ohio when the year was up, a decision Renee made before I did. Sitting across from me at our little rented kitchen table, with the renewal paperwork from our Ohio property manager in front of her, tapping the non-renewal box before I'd even finished reading the email out loud, which still strikes me as the real turning point looking back, more than any single scene or conversation. She called Ashley that week and told her we were staying, and I listened from the next room while my wife explained to our daughter, with more conviction than I'd managed in 2 years of trying to sell her on the same idea, why this had turned into a real life instead of my fantasy she was tolerating, using words like "my tutoring kids" and "my Thursday women" that hadn't existed in her vocabulary a year earlier. I asked her for this video if she'd let me share what she actually thinks now, and she laughed and said I could, as long as I got it right, so let me try to get it right. She told me the anger was never really about Thailand specifically. It was about being informed instead of consulted, about a decision that reorganized her entire life, arriving at her like weather instead of like a partnership. The exact same feeling, she said, as when a school district reorganizes your classroom assignment without asking. Except this was her whole life, instead of just her September. Once we actually rebuilt it as a partnership, the test drive, the split research, the reversible rental instead of the burned bridge, the place itself had room to become something she chose rather than something she survived. She told me the kids in that after-school program did more for her in 4 months than 11 years of book club discussions about other people's problems ever had. And I don't think she meant that as an insult to the book club, just an honest accounting of what she'd been missing without knowing she was missing it. She also told me something I hadn't expected, which is that she doesn't think she'd have found any of this. The tutoring, Kanya, the Thursday women, if I'd gotten my original way and simply moved us both in one triumphant motion 2 years earlier. I needed to almost lose something first, Tristan, she said. You don't go looking for a life of your own when you think somebody already handed you one you're supposed to just accept. Ashley and the grandkids came to visit 2 months ago, the first trip since the airport goodbye that had felt, at the time, like a small funeral. I watched my daughter watch her mother move through Chiang Mai with an ease and a fluency that clearly startled her, ordering food in halting but functional Thai, waving at Kanya's daughter across the market, negotiating with a tuk-tuk driver over a fare, with the specific brisk confidence of a woman who'd once run a classroom of 25 8-year-olds and had apparently transferred every ounce of that authority intact to a Thai market street. Ashley pulled me aside on the second day, half laughing, half genuinely unsettled, and said, "Dad, Mom just told a tuk-tuk driver he was overcharging her, in Thai, and he apologized." On the last night, Ashley said to me, quietly on the balcony, watching her mother laugh with Kanya over something on a phone screen, "Dad, I came here half expecting to convince Mom to come home. I don't think that's happening, is it?" I told her honestly that I didn't think so either, and that I'd spent 2 years trying to talk Renee into a version of this life that only existed because I wanted it, and it had taken both of us nearly failing at it completely before either of us built one that was actually hers too. We keep the Ohio house rented out still, on purpose, a decision Renee insisted on more firmly than I did. Not as an escape hatch anymore, but as a kind of respect for the version of herself that needed one 14 months ago, and might someday need one again. A compromise I've come to see as its own quiet form of trust between us, rather than any lingering doubt. I think that's the real lesson underneath everything I've just told you, more than any visa detail or budget line. It's not that Thailand fixed my marriage. It's that Thailand gave my wife room to rebuild an identity I'd nearly flattened without meaning to. And once she'd built it herself, on her own terms in her own time, she didn't want to leave the thing she'd made, which turned out to be a very different thing than the thing I'd originally dragged her toward, and a far sturdier one for both of us because of it. I'm Tristan. Thank you for listening to Retirement Without Borders.